United States, and Minnesota's chief federal judge has ordered the head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement to appear in court, threatening contempt sanctions over what he calls repeated defiance of judicial orders. The U.S. District Judge, Patrick Schiltz, says his patience is at an end, accusing ICE of slow walking or outright ignoring release orders tied to Operation Metro Surge, a major immigration crackdown in the Twin Cities. The judge says immigrants ordered released have remained detained, been transferred out of the state, or left stranded far from their families, despite court rulings in their favor. Schiltz's order targets ICE Acting Director Todd Lyons, who must personally explain why the agency failed to comply with a January release order. Joining us now to discuss the developing situation in Minneapolis is Raymond Vickery. He's an international affairs expert, American attorney, and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Raymond, as always, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a great pleasure in having these conversations with you. Of course, this situation in Minneapolis is developing. We're seeing ICE agents leave the city. However, operations have been going on there for about 2 weeks now. We've now seen a judge order the ICE chief for the operation to court. Checks and balances in terms of this situation, and over the past 2 weeks, how do we assess them about how they've acted in not just this situation, but of course the broader events which have occurred in Minnesota during the deployment of ICE troops?
Well, thanks very much for having me and allowing me to comment. You know, democracy requires more than just elections. It requires a rule of law. It requires respect for human rights. And under the U.S. Constitution, as you point out, there's a system of checks and balances in which the judicial arm of the government, the courts, and the legislative are to act as a check on the executive branch. Unfortunately, President Donald Trump has not seen to conduct himself or his administration in accordance with constitutional requirements and norms. Instead, he has opted for what they call a unitary presidency, meaning one which is unchecked. You will recall that in the New York Times article in regard to foreign affairs, he said there is no check on me except my own morality, which is questionable at best. So this is a situation which is deteriorated because President Trump has chosen Minnesota, and particularly because of the Somalia immigrants there, some of whom were involved in a scheme to defraud. He wants to paint the entire community in Minnesota with that and a show of strength. But of course, it's not working at this point in regard to the district courts, and they are standing up with release orders and for due process. So it's a very, very difficult situation. I note that the administration president seems to have backed off somewhat, at least in terms of its rhetoric. But make no mistake about it, this is a part of the President Donald Trump's push to show that he does not have to operate with congressional or judicial restraints, and he can do as he pleases. I believe that U.S. institutions will hold, but it's going to be a very, very difficult time.
Raymond, Minnesota has been a Democratic state since 1976. Has voted for the Democratic presidential candidate every single time since then. But of course, over the past 24 hours, we've seen developments come out of this, and we've seen a a change in stance from Donald Trump. We saw a Truth Social post where he said that he just talked to Governor Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and he said that their visions were aligned on immigration and his pledge to work with them. We've also, of course, seen him withdraw his ICE chief there, Bavino, and send Border Czar Tom Homan to Minneapolis to assess the situation, whatever that means. Of course, how do you see this situation play out? Have the protesters got Donald Trump to concede here? Of course, by losing two American citizens in the process, of course.
Well, I think the polls are showing politically what he's doing with ICE and turning it into really a federal police force for general purposes is not going over well. The killings which have taken place by ICE, the so-called administrative warrants, where you don't even have a judge who's signing off on breaking and entering, which is flatly contrary to the United States Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which prevents unreasonable searches and seizures. And finally, I think that President Trump is seeing that this is really eating into the swing voters. The MAGA voters will never change. As President Trump has said, he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they wouldn't change. But there are reasonable people who are looking at this situation and saying, this is not America. This is not what we have fought for over 250 years, and it's hurting. So he is having to back off. Now, whether it means anything really in terms of how he acts and how ICE acts is very doubtful. Donald Trump is an expert at trying to create a false reality. And if there is some chink in that, as there was at the time of COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, then he backs off and says, well, I never said that, that's not what I meant, and so forth.
Yes.
It's a very, very difficult situation.
Raymond, do stay with us as we move over to another ICE-related development and U.S.